Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this session. We really appreciate you coming out. And if you're in the right place, SYN231. This is Architecting for the Workspace for High Security. My name is Mike Nelson. I am a solution technologist with Rubrik. I am also a Citrix CTA, former Citrix CTP. Welcome to the CTP community that's here today. And I'm also a Microsoft MVP and Azure advisor. With me today.
Thanks, Mike. Hi, everyone. I'm Kurt Romer, Chief Security Strategist for Citrix. My journey with Citrix began back in the early 90s as a customer. I was responsible for rolling out the Citrix environment and integrating it with OS/2 and doing all kinds of fun stuff. After 4 years of that, moved on, ran the services organization for NetFrame, the big super servers. 1/3 of our business was running Citrix on those, which was tremendous back in the day. Ran a consulting firm that specialized in Citrix as one of our practices, and along that journey, that's where I met Mike. We've always talked about presenting together, and this is the first time we're doing it here live, so yeah. It's great to be here.
And just so everybody knows, you can hashtag for the session. If you feel free to go ahead and tweet this out, the Citrix Synergy Future of Work. You can always contact me on Twitter at NellMedia. Kurt says he's a little bit too old for that Twitter stuff. So
yeah. We do have a special surprise for everyone today. There's a brand new ebook out on helping you to envision the workspace. So when you go back and you're sharing this information with your team, with your management, in particular your line of business leaders, this ebook is very focused on explaining to the business the value of the workspace and expanding on a lot of the concepts and use cases we're talking about today. We're also going to have some very deep architectural content back behind this that we're releasing very soon. So you're in the right place to get a great intro.
Right, and I'd also like to introduce our third presenter, who is actually a virtual guest. Presenter. Her name is Joan, and just to give you a little background, I had the opportunity to interview Joan for different areas of topic areas around security and such, but she was graceful in allowing us to ask some specific questions and get her feedback from a first-hand perspective. Now, I'll let her introduce herself.
So my title is a systems analyst. I work in health and human services for a local government. I'm actually an IT person that's located within the business unit of health and human services. I've been there for about 20 years, and I've been doing what I do for about 30 years. I'm working basically for 7 different agencies within one department. I am a HIPAA privacy security compliance officer. I'm responsible to ensure that staff within the department have the appropriate minimum necessary access to information, both verbal, written, and electronic, within all of our local applications, as well as over about 60 state applications.
Now, as you heard, Joan has quite a bit of security responsibilities, not around just users, but also devices. And now we'll get into a little bit about the workspace.
Yep, definitely. If you haven't seen it, Microsoft recently introduced the SECCON framework, similar to the DEF CON framework, different levels. And when you look at this, you realize that there's a lot of varying security responsibilities within most organizations, ranging from fairly basic security needs up to the most stringent security needs. The people who are managing your keys, your certificates, your domain administrators, your Cisco administrators, other things along those lines. What we're focusing on today is talking about the privileged portion of this chart. And so I wanted to show this, helps to frame a lot of the discussion out. We're going to focus on some of the things to help your most privileged workers.
Right, so from here we're saying that with, the saying, with great power comes even greater responsibility, right? And this can't be truer than when you're dealing with the privileged workspace. Because if you think about it, not only you, if you're in this situation where you have this privilege, which I'm sure most, if not all of you do, you have unwielding power over things that you can control from a user's perspective, device, applications, data, so on and so forth. And what you need to do is you need to understand that anyone also that can become you or impersonate you also will have that power. And it's important to understand that. It's important to understand how wide that privilege can go. So what we're going to do is we're going to let Joan talk a little bit about that.
If I became the bad actor, given my current privileges, I could delete, I could edit, I could copy, and I could sell a whole lot of information about every consumer that has ever entered our facility, both their family information, medically, and financial information. I could print off every social security number and all the medical diagnoses on every client that has ever come into our facility. And I'm pretty sure I could probably make a pretty good dollar in the black market with that information.
Yeah, and this is a real person. This isn't someone reading a script. I think it definitely qualifies as privileged, and you'll hear a little bit more from Joan. But it's not just about locking somebody like that down so that it makes it almost impossible for Joan to do her job and the rest of us. It's about really making sure that we're balancing security, productivity, and costs, and being able to dynamically balance those so that we've got the best experience at all points in time, but we're protecting very sensitive resources at the utmost level when we need to.
Right. So let's just frame up a little bit what we're going to be talking about during the rest of the presentation. We are going to be talking different aspects, defining and defending, okay, privilege. As we talk through this, you're going to see the different aspects of that. We're going to be looking at the privileged workspace and how to actually design it. Then contextual trust. We'll explain that a little bit. We'll talk about how to dynamically manage that. Then we'll go on to what Kurt and I put together as some thoughts, tools, techniques, so on and so forth, for optimizing the security, productivity, and the cost.
Okay, so we're going to start with a fairly basic definition. What is privilege? And I'll go ahead and read this because it's a little small up there on the screen. Privilege is defined as a special right, advantage, or immunity granted or available only to a particular person or group. All right. How many of us have immunity? You've got immunity granted to you? How many of you would like it?
Any members of Congress in here?
Yeah.
Sorry.
It's interesting. When you look at a definition of privilege, it doesn't always map through to what we think it is. So let's explore that a little further. Who is privileged?
Right. So we're going to look at who is actually privileged. You look at yourself, you look at the folks that you work on your team, the people that are around your department, your organization. It's not only in that area. A lot of folks tend to kind of compartmentalize and containerize it into just, you know, your immediate teammates and such. But it goes beyond that. It goes to the outside. It goes to third parties, external workers, even going so far as auditors, internal, external, board members. How many of you know that actually board members have privilege that could affect, you know, your users and your data and so on?
Yeah, so really the litmus test is anybody who has responsibility for people, process, technology, or strategy at a material level is privileged. Okay, take a look at this list. I'm not going to run through this because I'm sure everybody in this room is familiar with things that are on here, but one thing I bet you haven't thought about. How do these apply to your privileged workforce? Are you doing anything different for your privileged users to help address a lot of the threats that are on this list? And if so, why not? We really should be, right? So we've got to think about that, but we can't make anything more complex because complexity is not just the enemy of security. It also deeply affects productivity and cost. So we got to find a way to address this, but make life a little more easy to manage.
Let's hear Joan in a situation that she has.
We did have a situation occur a couple of years ago where a user clicked on something in an email and that something brought ransomware into our environment. If something like that had happened with my login, it would be devastating.
Right, absolutely would be devastating. Anyone in this room that can attest to that, it would be devastating to not only you, but the organization and the people, anyone that's involved. So in that scenario, having an actual, you know, privileged workspace defined is critical. So when you take a look at this, how would you architect a privileged workspace? Okay, think about that. How would you actually start even conceptualizing a design of privilege in the workspace that has to be defined. So we're going to hear another example scenario where a privileged workspace could be created, and security could be situationally aware. It can be contextual and automated.
I have the ability to have access to information that no one but our director has access to as well. I have the requirement to do background checks on all of our staff, all of our physicians, as well as our managers and our director. As a result of that, I have access to driver's license numbers, social security numbers, and highly confidential information, as well as the results of those background checks.
Now, I find that incredibly interesting. I really do, because if you think about it, the amount of information that she has, just in her daily job and doing these types of investigations and background checks and such like that, in a government situation, in a public sector type situation, that can be almost unnerving. And is it really something that, you want to do? I don't know if I'd want to do that.
No.
So I give her a lot of credit for that. And the extent of the secure information that Joan has access to, as well as how high up the chain it goes. How high does it go? How much information does she actually have on elected officials? Okay, things like that. To me, from a security aspect, that's something that just has to be defined. It has to be, put into some kind of a process and a container, if you will, in order to exercise the privilege. Okay. So what I want to do is I want to take this a little bit differently. So my history is I've been in IT for 35 some years, a long time. But I started out and I was actually part of a break-fix, part-time break-fix type scenario, and then I moved up to into system administrator. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to step you through a little bit of what I went through as a system administrator, and some of you may experience the same things. If we have a lot of sysadmins, virtual admins, Citrix admins, I'm not sure if do we have any C-levels or management in the audience? I don't know if you want to admit it, but okay, so good. That's good to hear. So I started out, as a young sysadmin, okay? This is actually my son, my oldest, and next week he is graduating high school, and he wants nothing, absolutely nothing to do with IT, which is, kind of a good thing and a bad thing, really. But this is my home office as it stood 20-some years ago when I started to work for a tax and accounting firm. And when I take a look at this, I think back because the things that I would do remotely, via modem, dial-up at that time, but I would be able to access that data, and I'd be able to bring it in my home office, and I would actually have that information in my home office. So I started to think about how I actually tried to secure my workspace. It wasn't secure. Let me look, my son could access the information. So it wasn't secure at all, really. But I'd like to take you on a brief, walkthrough of the experience. So when we start out as a sysadmin, you're really given the keys to the kingdom, right? That's what you're given. And these keys unlock so many different doors. They unlock so many different privileges. They allow you access to things that, sometimes you don't necessarily want access to, kind of like, and some of you might relate to this, kind of like images in your head you just can't forget that you don't want to have in your head. Because, you see, hear, and do things that, have a history trail and may affect other people in different ways.
And it looks like all those keys and access privileges just accumulate and are never taken away.
Forever.
You probably have more in a drawer somewhere.
Yeah, they actually they keep on growing because people just throw them at you. They're like, oh, you take care of security here. We bought this, you can take care of that. We bought that, you can take care of that. But also one thing that really got to me as a sysadmin is it kind of crossed boundaries. It kind of went into my personal life, not just my professional life. And the reason for that is because, like I said, I had information at home, right? But I was also had information when it would be like in interpersonal communications, sitting down talking to someone, having a beer with somebody, something like that. You never know when something, might slip out. Something might, we might get into a conversation about something. And I didn't have any boundaries around that. Back then, there was really no boundaries around it. It was security. It was like there was no investigations. When, we never did any investigations. Maybe in the larger organizations, obviously they did, but in smaller shops, they never really did anything like that. So when you think about it, a lot of what I did was, quite honestly, acting like a cowboy, you know, kind of shooting from the hip and hope I hit something. That's about, you know, what my job was when it came to security. So in the kingdom, okay, our privilege extends to a whole bunch of different objects. When you're talking about objects that are around all of the different things that you interact with, the people, going from the home down to, you know, even the recycle bin, audio, mail, communication, all kinds of different things that can affect that. Okay, and when you think about all that, how do you think about it compared to what some other people think? Okay, so if I was going to ask you, what is the definition? What do you think about the privileged workspace? Okay, how would you answer that? Well, I went around and I asked a few people, a few really smart people that I know, to give me their thoughts on that. One of them was Brian, who I worked with in the insurance industry. He was a CISO. And he said, on paper, securing the privileged workspace is the easy part. It's the people part that's hard. How many people can relate to that? Really, I mean, it's really, I mean, you can put stuff down on paper, you can create processes, you can, you know, write until you're blue in the face. But if you can't get the people to actually do it, that's the hardest part. That's where you get affected. That's where you're, you know, you make mistakes and things like that. Another one, this one comes from Dennis, who is here at the conference, by the way, independent security consultant and an author, not on security, but on EUC. He's a privilege causes problems, and depending on how those problems are handled, they very well could be career-ending ones. Let that sink in for a second. Privilege can cause problems, and if you don't handle it right, yeah, you could be in a lot of trouble, or actually, you know, moving responsibility to someone like your boss or something like that and get them in trouble. Next up, we have, Vinesh. Vinesh is a good friend of mine. I'm from Wisconsin. He's part of the hospital healthcare. Everyone is privileged, from the basic user to the CTO. What matters is what data is being accessed, what app is being used, and what physical space they are in when it's used. That's true. It really is. Because you have to think about all those different aspects when you're looking at the overall workspace. And then lastly, we have Mark, who is a lead security analyst, consulting partner. Security privilege is a very broad and diverse subject with people. Honestly, identifying what it is isn't the hard part for me, but getting people to agree on it is. So he even took Brian's and took it even a step back and said, I can write all this stuff up, but getting someone to agree that that's what it should be is the hard part. We haven't even gotten to the real people part and implementing it. It's just the agreement on it.
So let's take a look at how we would design a privileged workspace to help address a lot of the issues we've seen. When you look at the design considerations, you have to be able to combine the people, the process, the technology, and strategy, and it's got to bridge both physical and cyber. It has to be very comprehensive because we have physical and cyber integrations with IoT, with robotics, with a lot of virtualization technologies and a lot of visualization technologies, and it brings in safety aspects as well. So this privileged workspace really needs to be able to help across all of our usage. And of course, it's got to be focused on the business. It has to be zero trust from the foundation, because if you don't start with zero trust and verify and roots of trust and build on top of that, you're building on top of shaky ground. So be able to get all the way down to a verifiable roots of trust and then build on top of it. The next piece is probably the key point on this slide. It has to not just be identity enabled, but also persona enlightened. Why is that? Well, what's identity? If you ask most people, identity is their credentials, right? That's kind of the common definition. We all know it's a little more than that. But oftentimes, even if you express the absolute strongest identity in the world, what if you've got multiple personas? What if you're an administrator for multiple different domains, different clouds, different applications? Should you be applying the same identity as you make major changes to each of those environments, maybe even across competitive boundaries? I would argue no. Identity is great, but it's not granular enough. We need to move to being able to manage personas.
That's true.
A big part of what we're going to be talking with all of this is designing automation and augmentation into the workforce. And Mike's got some really, really great thoughts around there that we'll work on. And another key aspect is resource delivery. We've got to rethink resource delivery. Right now, resource delivery has been based on portals and all kinds of other things. Let's think of resource delivery in a little different way. So let's take a look at what that might be. If you're delivering resources, any resource, you have one of 4 ways to do that. You can go direct, otherwise known as native access. This lets somebody go right to the technology. You pick up your brand new laptop, tablet, smartphone, whatever, and you go right out to the web, your SaaS apps, your cloud. The second way to deliver a resource is through a proxy. Forward, reverse, content filtering, scrubbing, rewrites, redirects, all the great things that proxies do. I caution you on one thing here, though. A lot of times when people think proxy, they think network proxy. It's one aspect. You can have proxies all over the place, including embedded in browser frameworks, and we're going to talk about that. Proxies are going to be even more useful as we move to the cloud. Third way, no big surprise, virtualization. Virtualization allows you to deliver a representation of the experience without actually having to deliver the data down to the endpoint, without having to push all that HTML every time somebody clicks on a new link or hovers over something. So virtualization gives us some really interesting ways to deliver resources. We'll talk about that more in a second. The fourth way, of course, is containerization. When you think of containerization, too, think beyond just Docker and Kubernetes, very important container frameworks. There's also mobile container frameworks. There's project-based container frameworks. Containers are basically for mobilizing the experience, and they also help to enable an offline use case. So regardless of what resource you're delivering, you're using one of these 4 methods today. What I would argue, though, is you should use a mix of these 4 methods. And instead of determining this when you purchase the application or publish the application, you can dynamically determine this based on context. And so you can pick the right delivery method for the right situation. Let's get into a couple examples of that. One very common example is using the web. Web browsing is really easy, right? You just click on the browser, go to a resource. Well, that's the way it should be, but web browsing is also very complicated in the back end. Most web browsers are extremely over-configured. They've got every framework known to mankind built in, from Flash, Java, JavaScript, Silverlight. You've got ad blockers integrated with there, other extensions, things that you might have, plugins for other applications. You've got certificate chains for your country, other countries, countries you might not completely trust. But guess what? It's all there. It's got access to your file system, your registry, your keys, your passwords. I mean, browsers are completely over-configured, right? Big deal. What do we use browsers for? Yeah, everything these days. They're used from the casual watching a couple cat videos or catching up on some current news and events to being able to go through and administer the cloud and cloud resources, and in one click be able to create or completely destroy an entire enterprise's cloud presence. We have to do a much better job at protecting browsers. So with that as a quick setup for this slide, when you look at delivering browsers as a resource, you can either have the browser on the endpoint, run the native one, as you see all the way on the left. It's typically what comes embedded. Usually it's a very OS-embedded browser with a lot of connectivity. I would say that's only used for some fairly low-risk type of situations. Increasingly on the device, you can also have a containerized browser. And you see that with things like Chromium. You see that with Microsoft, with what they're doing with Edge and integrating the Chromium aspects. You even see that with Citrix, with Workspace app, and some other features that we've announced this week that help you better containerize the browser experience and make it more specific to purpose. So you can launch a containerized browser that only has access to a single application. Doesn't have all the frameworks turned on, just the ones you need. Doesn't have all the different domain access, just the ones you need. Same thing with certificates. You can make your browser much more specific to purpose.
Now, I have to interrupt because I can attest to this, because working with Kurt on this presentation, he was using that type of browser, and he made that the excuse that he couldn't help me create the deck because he couldn't, he didn't have the right extensions, he didn't have all that stuff. No,
sure. I made him do more work. In the middle is basically being able to run the browser within the data center. And you're familiar with that if you're a Citrix customer. You can publish a Windows or Linux experience. You can use any of the browsers that are out there, and you can deliver this through XenApp, XenDesktop. You can go ahead and deliver your virtual browser on top of HVI as well, so that it's got hypervisor introspection and capabilities to protect at the hypervisor level. And then you can also cloud host browsers. And why would you want to do that? Well, sometimes a cloud hosted browser is a lot closer to the application, which makes it faster. Sometimes a cloud hosted browser is within a specific region, which helps make it more compliant. Sometimes as well, a cloud hosted browser will allow you to have access to non-strategic traffic, things like Facebook, that you don't want on your network, you don't want on your systems, you don't want any of that in your logs. You might be running a library where you have to have open access within the United States and no content filtering, but people are searching for not safe for work materials. Why have that come across your network and be in your logs? Why not just have that stay in the cloud? People are using this for a lot of reasons, and it's one of the other options we have. On the right-hand side also are a lot of the technologies that you want to integrate with these browsers so that you've got additional security capabilities. And one that I like to call out on here is a web app firewall. If you have any browser-based portals that are accepting credentials, you're asking somebody to log in, you're asking for their password, their multi-factor credentials, make sure you've got a web app firewall in front of that. It gives you some additional protections to be able to look for people who are hacking against that site and give you some additional visibility. There's a lot more detail on this with browsing. Actually, I had a session on this yesterday with Bitdefender that went into quite a bit more detail, especially with the HVI aspects. Welcome you to watch the recording of that if you want to get into some more detail. Now, obviously, resource delivery applies across everything from Windows and Linux workloads, all kinds of different apps. I wanted to use browsers, and I wanted to use SaaS and cloud and web-based apps because that's the future, and the future's here.
That's right. So we have the 5 W's of context.
Yes, we do. So I talked about being able to dynamically pick the delivery method. You do that based on context, and the context is what I like to call the 5 W's: who, what, when, where, and why. For every single access request, for every single usage request, for every single transaction that's significant, you have to reevaluate these 5 W's of context and make sure that the device is still at a level that's trusted enough to be able to perform this transaction, that the location is sufficient to be able to access this resource. And maybe you're in the office and you get direct access because you're in the office. If you're going to be working on an airplane, that's probably going to need to be containerized in most places. What if your workspace did that for you and it put information out in your container that, because of its situational awareness of knowing that you're working on an airplane, is only risk-appropriate stuff that you should be working on when you're on the airplane? When we talk about automating the privileged workspace, that's what we're talking about. Taking these aspects of context that previously would have just been a static policy at login and applying it to everything that people do so that your situation is constantly being evaluated, part of situational awareness, and you're always working in a risk-appropriate fashion. And by the way, if there's any violations to that, you can either just gently nudge the user and say, hey, you're trying to send something that would violate company policy, or did you know that there's social security numbers in the back of this Excel spreadsheet you're sending, and be able to give them some active coaching without calling out the dogs and turning on all the alarms and sending in HR and legal, because honestly, sometimes people just make honest mistakes, right? But when there is something that's a serious violation, you now have visibility into exactly what, where, and why, and you can take more appropriate action, even automating that.
That's right. So now we're going to talk a little bit about some of the thoughts, tools, techniques that Kurt and I had come up with that we think are really important as kind of takeaways for this session.
Yeah, we'll start with some of the insights. You know, one of the challenges that we have as privileged workers these days is we don't always have all the intelligence that we need and all the insights to be able to do our jobs properly. I'll give you a little bit of an example. You know, you get up in the morning, what's one of the first things that most people do? No, not that. For information. You go out, you check your news, weather, and traffic. You want to know what's going on, what's relevant to you, what's important. You want to know what the conditions are, what the threat is. Are you going to be able to just go outside on a nice clear day, or do you need to go hide in the basement somewhere? And then from a traffic perspective, you know, what's your experience? Is it going to be fairly straightforward? Are you going to have any challenges working with other people? Are there certain things that are going to be causing latency or other concerns? Well, what if we built this into the workspace and you had intelligence that was curated just for you, telling you exactly what you need? New CERT vulnerability came out yesterday on Adobe Flash. Everything needs to be updated. Guess what? While you were sleeping, the workspace took care of that and said, everybody who's accessing a Flash-based app, we either patch that for you or we remediated it over by sending you to a virtual session that has the Flash player containerized so that somebody can't remotely attack it. And by the way, the guy who is supposed to update Flash for everybody is on vacation this week, so we sent it to the next in command. We automatically noticed that, sent it, here's what's going on, and by the way, here's how the remediation's going for you, here's the attacks are coming in, and here's what you need to tell your customers and suppliers. So think about automating some of the intelligence. Threats, you know, very similar. I'm sure there's a lot you can think about in terms of threats, but what if you had direct information on threats that were relevant, not just to your technology, but also to your business? Pulled from the news, pulled from internal sources, pulled from applications, curated on things that are actionable for you. And if they're not actionable for you or you don't need to make a decision, they've been automated for you. And then similarly with the experience, how can you make sure that you're understanding exactly what to expect as you're working with others, as you're making changes to the environment, as maybe downtime in a cloud service causes some blips? How do you make sure that this is handled and any of the constraints are noticed as well? So build this into the workspace and make our lives a lot easier. This is the first and most basic step.
Right, and now we're going to have hear from Joan here. Maybe not.
There is so much time waiting for someone else to do something, when if we just spent some time creating the automation and did a proactive approach to protect me as well as my employer, to make sure that I have the access and the information that I need at a minimum level, it just seems like the right thing to do.
So I personally found that part of the interview that I had with her very compelling because she's basically saying that it would not only make things easier for her and her supervisor, her management, even her users from an aspect of implementing security. If you could automate, if you could bring some of those controls and make it easier for them and make it easier on their lives overall, it would make her professional life and her personal life a lot easier. And what Kurt was talking about, automating those things is really key. So I'm going to talk about Joan's interview here and a couple takeaways I want you to get. I had this interview with Joan, lasted about a half an hour. Its recording was cut down to about 12 and a half minutes. You'll be able to download the entire recording unedited, except for, you know, the bloopers and outtakes and, you know, stuff like that. But you'll be able to download that with the deck, so you can hear the whole thing in its entirety, like we didn't doctor anything or edit anything and, you know, make Joan say something she never really said. The only thing is that she didn't want to give a real name because she works for a government entity, and she didn't want her likeness used because obviously she's not at a position that she can do that. But some key takeaways: the public sector isn't that much different from the private sector. How many people in here actually work in the public sector or work for government? Anybody in here? Do you? Okay. So you can kind of jive with what Joan is saying, right? In terms of, you know, how the processes and policies and hierarchy. Maybe there's a little bit more bureaucracy and red tape in the public sector, but it's pretty similar to the private sector today. They're kind of lining up together. You still have to do the same things. You still have to architect for privilege. There are layers and layers and layers. If you listen to the whole interview, she goes through and talks about the different things. She has to go through 12 steps just to get someone a permission. She has to go through a 12-step process, kind of the 12 steps, you know. She has to go through the 12-step process to do that. So you have layers of permissions, applications, processes, and policies, like I had mentioned. Unfiltered access to privileged information, both personal and professional. This is what I talked about before. When she has access to, you know, private information, personal information for people that are elected officials, management, you know, directors, so on and so forth, that are above her pay grade. That itself can be, you know, empowering, but at the same time, it can be detrimental as well. And then finally, part of her interview that wasn't in the clips was, I asked the question, I said, if she could actually estimate the amount of automation that she currently has today. And if you listen to it, you'll hear her say that she estimates about 20% of what she does is automated. Now, I think that's extremely generous because we went through some of the things that are automated and some things that aren't automated, and I can tell you that we spent a lot more time on the stuff that isn't. So I think she's being a little bit generous there, but I think it's a step ahead for her because what she came from 20 years ago with pencil and paper is now, you know, automated to, you know, what she thinks is automated. What you know, it's better than what I used to do, right? And then finally, life would just be easier with automation. I can't impress that enough. Everyone in this room should, you know, automate all the things. It's really, it really can do justice in terms of helping you out in your career and in general, life in general. Look at home automation, things like that. It's spreading out beyond just the workplace. Mm-hmm. So finally, some more thoughts here. I'm not going to go through all these. What I would like to highlight is the first one, automate the mundane, like I mentioned before. Take the opportunity. If it doesn't have to cost anything, it could be your own experience, learning how to automate, learning how to use tools to automate. But also, you know, take a look at how you do security. Maybe there are just some simple steps you can break down from 5 steps down to 2, or, you know, and implement workflows, things like that. And then finally, I believe, and it's time to launch your digital twin. Now, I can tell you from personal, there are probably a lot of people that don't want to see a second me. And what I mean by a digital twin is the ability to have, you know, that AI, that persona, be able to do those tasks for you, to automate those tasks. And that persona would be a virtual persona that can go out and you just tell it, go do these things, take care of this for me, and it knocks it out. You have to be careful with that, obviously. A lot of testing involved, so on and so forth. But the digital twin is, and what we believe, is inherently the future of how security is going to be handled in the workforce.
Yeah, and if you think about it from a digital twin perspective, Mike needs to sleep at some point in time. I'm assuming you have some personal life. Think of all the time that you're not spending working. The attacks are still coming in, business issues still happen, customers still have needs and desires. So the digital twin will be there helping to take care of that for you. But even when you are working, one of the other things on this slide that we really need to address is the disruption and distraction aspect of all of our jobs. If we could just take that away, we would be so much more effective and so much happier. So that's also something we build into the workspace and have to concentrate on that. A couple of other things to think about. You know, passwords, we all know we have to get away from. Multi-factor auth is something you have to have if you are privileged. And we've got to make sure that that's out there and look for anybody who is privileged, who does not have two-factor, multi-factor enabled, and get that fixed right now. As we talked about dynamically deploying resources, and we talked about the 5 W's of context and being able to do everything so that it's situationally aware and risk appropriate, that's not just for access. That's not just at login. That is all throughout lifecycle usage. That is another really big change as we move to the privileged workspace, is we're focusing on usage. A lot of technologies have to be integrated. We have to constantly be thinking about how to reduce the attack space or how to properly mitigate it based on those deployment options. And the last piece is one that I want everybody to think about quite a bit, because there are projects out there for infrastructure as code. And probably many of you in this room are engaged in those projects, and that's great to be able to automate your IT processes. But take that even further so that configuration as code is working for not just the infrastructure technologies, but other technologies. And also as business processes and practices. Onboarding, offboarding, so you have somebody who gains a certain level of privilege, they're flagged, and as they leave roles or leave the organization, that privilege is appropriately reduced or taken away. And that's something that can be completely built in and scanned for as you have code. And as you're making changes to privacy policies, as you're making changes to appropriate use policies, some of your internal IT best practices, if those are expressed as code, it's much easier to look at the impact of that change, model the impact of that change, and be able to go back and do retrospectives on where things were in the past. And guess what? The ultimate expression of that takes that all the way through to your culture. So there are many organizations that are embarking on improving their culture to be able to better manage security and get people to have more of a security focus. If you can express culture as code and build that into the privileged workspace, you're helping to constantly be coaching people to do the right things.
That's right. So our key takeaways from the session, we're down here to our final minutes. Privilege is the currency of digital transformation. Okay, buzzword alert, digital transformation. Everybody's kind of using those buzzwords. But really, black hats and white hats already know this. It's not a secret. It's, it's something that everybody knows. So protect your privileges, but not only yours, but any highly privileged users that you have. You, as a responsibility, even as just from a good citizen standpoint, you need to help out and do that as a sysadmin, as an administrator in IT in general.
Yep. And personas are the new perimeter. We've got to make sure that we're moving beyond just simple expressions of identity, and we're really thinking about what is the persona that you need to be expressing, what are the boundaries of that persona, how does it interface with your other personas or isolate from your other personas, and make sure you're building that into the workspace as well. And that definitely helps as you're further automating and augmenting and engaging your digital twin, because you definitely want to set some boundaries there.
Right, and finally, just like it says, envision and embrace the privileged workstation as a massively, disruptive force for transformation. You now have superpowers. When I was a sysadmin, I wish I had those superpowers, and I realized those superpowers that I had, because I would have probably used them, in a much better way. I would have thought about a lot of things before I actually acted on them, and with more forethought. So use them wisely. That is it for us. We'd like to thank everyone for coming. We have about a minute and a half here. If anybody has a quick question for us. Do you have anything else you want to add before we?
Yeah, why don't we intro the ebook?
Oh.
Yeah.
Here we go.
So this has just been posted. Nobody else has this right now, and it's something where the link's up on the top if you can take a quick picture of it. Otherwise, you'll get this as part of the slides. Like I said, this is something that you can hand out to your line of business leaders, to people who don't even know what a workspace is and why some of the concepts we're talking about in here are so essential. It's going to help you intro what you need to do to the rest of the organization. This is step one of a lot of content that we've got developed that will get you into developing the privileged workspace concepts that Mike and I have talked about here today. So.
And with that, we have about 30 seconds left. We thank you very much for coming, Kurt and I, and we hope you enjoyed it and you learned something. If you have any questions for us, you can talk to us afterwards, or you can reach me on at Twitter at NellMedia. And I'm sure if you send a homing pigeon over to Kurt's way, he'll be able to answer.
Postcard with an actual stamp.
Yeah, that postcard too. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.